It's my great pleasure to introduce someone who you all know, and that is Curtis Roth. This is a wonderful time of the year where we see student work come to fruition, see it up, see it exposed, get to know the work better. And I think it's a wonderful time also to look at the engagement of one of our wonderful additions to the faculty here these last 2 years, as it turns out. Curtis Roth was with us last year through the Roth Professorship, and this year through the Lefevre Fellowship. And as you know, one aspect of this fellowship is the development of a project. And I've had a bit of a sneak preview of the exhibition, which you will see later, and it is stunning, absolutely stunning. And for me, what it shows is evidence of an obsession that is productively pursued. And so without further ado, Curtis Roth.
Okay. So what I've been working on lately begins with a letter. And this is a letter written in the springtime of 1970 from an architectural writer based in New York named John Margulies. And the letter was addressed to a collection of architects who in the late 1960s and early 1970s were practicing what might be variously called either sort of conceptual architecture or speculative practices, and Ed Ruscha also. The request that John Margulies sent them was for a conceptual project in its own right, the development of a special issue of the publication, Design Quarterly, which is a kind of now defunct publication published by the Walker Art Center up through the 1990s. And in it, he was effectively trying to develop a model for a new publication, or a publication which could begin to support alternate types of architecture. And in the publication, it was sort of entirely unedited, but totally curated. In other words, he basically selected these architects and then gave them free rein over the pages in which he gave them, right, to develop a response to the rather vaguely stated topic of conceptual architecture. Right? So this is sort of all he gave them, and what he got back was mixed, to say the least. So for instance, Ant Farm sent in WLS, which stands for the world's largest snake. It's a building shaped like a snake. Groups like Arkazoom sent a fraction or a sort of developmental piece of their project for No Stop City. Ed Ruscha sent pictures of his old girlfriends. This is Kenya Sanderson. But in general, these were all projects which were developed. He may have had more than 5, I don't know. This is just 5. But in general, they were all projects which were already published elsewhere, which were sort of repurposed for this exhibition. There were 2 projects, though, in the collection of roughly 9 or 10 projects which were submitted, which were developed specifically in response to Margulies' letter. And they actually bookended the publication, so one begins it and the other ends it. The one that begins it is one that's, I think, quite well known, right? So Peter Eisenman's Notes on Conceptual Architecture. The first version, the erased version, the version in which Eisenman writes the letter, or the essay about conceptual architecture, and then erases the essay, leaving only the kind of footnotes which testify to the labor necessary to construct the essay, minus the ability to sort of evaluate the contents of the essay. So this is a kind of canonical piece of architecture, produced here in 1970. The second piece, which I don't think many people know about, is a piece produced by Super Studio, and it was a performance piece, and it's called Hidden Architecture. And oddly enough, they share a kind of really strange similarity with each other. So this is the kind of concluding piece in the special issue of Design Quarterly. It's published in sort of 5 parts, so it begins with a short paragraph. It's then followed by 14 photographs. Here is sort of 13. There's a letter written by a lawyer friend of the group Super Studio, who is also a faculty member at the University of Florence, and is still a faculty member at the University of Florence. And then it's sort of concluded with the group's resumes and their professional qualifications. So the performance begins. I'll just read this short introduction to the performance with the idea that Perhaps architectural magazines, in trying to communicate theories, projects, and buildings, may set up a form of fictitious communication through semantic redundancy, reaching the point of publishing only themselves. It is therefore an act of coherence to attempt a logical extrapolation of this project, and to propose a project which coincides with the act of its own transmission, a publication coinciding with the published project. So the way the performance works, it begins with a box. The box is 250 by 350 by 75 millimeters, so roughly the size of a letter sheet of paper. It's made out of zinc and it's unpolished. But the box is actually preceded with a project, or it may be preceded with a project, we're not exactly sure. So Super Studio claims that they've designed a project, and the project is contained in a series of drawings, but the audience never sees this project. The project, which may or may not exist, is then copied with carbon paper. 3 copies are produced to the project, and the original is burned. And here you see the burning, which is being overseen by the lawyer, Andre Orsi Battolini, to ensure that it's properly burned. The ashes are then crunched up and broken into a collection of different pieces. The 3 copies, which they made prior to the burning of the original project, are then wrapped in cellophane and rubber cement to create a kind of hermetic seal. On top of this, they're then wrapped in aluminum foil and tape, and these, this sort of bundle of the copied projects are then inserted into the box. The box is then soldered shut, again soldered shut, polished to a kind of mirror finish. And then the lawyer, Andre Orsi Battolini, then signs a kind of testament, this letter, which certifies that Super Studio has in fact engaged in the kind of act which they claim to engage in the beginning. He stamps it with the kind of legal stamp, which you see up at the top, and then Super Studio poses for the 14th and final photograph with their shiny box. It's also labeled, sorry for that. This all occurred June 25th, 1970, so a few months actually before the publication of the Design Quarterly issue. And so here's the group, and this has in a way become one of the kind of iconic photographs of the Super Studio group from this moment. So while a lot of people, I think this is not such a, I mean, certainly not a well-known project within their collection of work. I think Super Studio is in a way primarily known for 2 projects. The first being the Continuous Monument Project, which occurs prior to Hidden Architecture in 1968. And the second being the 5 Fundamental Acts Project, which is exhibited at MoMA in the Emilio Andaz show in 1972. And while I think oftentimes these 2 projects are conflated with each other because they share certain aesthetic affinities, I think in many ways they're actually 180 degrees from each other. The first, the Continuous Monument, testifies to the kind of radical extension of architecture until the entire planet basically becomes architecture, whereas the second, the 5 Fundamental Acts series, is basically an extremely depressing project in which architecture itself is erased and architecture disappears, and in fact all objects disappear. It's a kind of planet without objects, basically. In the middle is Hidden Architecture, and in this way, Super Studio's basically their sort of lost faith in the modern project begins to manifest itself in the work after the original Hidden Architecture proposal. So the 5 Fundamental Acts project is the last project they do. It's what they do immediately after Hidden Architecture, and then following that 5 Fundamental Acts project, they basically abandon design altogether. They begin something called Project Zeno, which is a kind of anthropological research which attempts to collect the last remaining fragments of true architecture on Earth. So for them, this project is literally the sort of end of design in their minds, and particularly the end of the modern project. So I'm interested in it because I quite like Super Studio, and so I think it's a kind of relevant project within their work. But at the same time, I'm interested in it in this kind of moment, historically, in which 2 architects who I think you would have trouble in 1970 finding 2 more dramatically different architectural ideologies managed to converge within a single publication by producing 2 projects which basically work through the same mechanism in which they produce a project. They then erase that project and present only the labor necessary to construct the project, minus the project itself. So Super Studio presents, of course, the fabrication of the box, and Eisenman presents the kind of intellectual labor of constructing an essay, minus the essay. Right? And I think this is a moment which I would argue still somehow lives with us today, or this question of the kind of interior and the exterior of the box, and the question of how we, let's say, justify the things that we do, and also the things that we don't do as architects. And so this is something which is, let's say, quite interesting for me in general. So it was at this moment that I was going to then, that was like kind of my introduction, and I was going to jump into the project itself, so I was going to show you the work. But I thought this sort of setup was somehow a little bit too autobiographical, and I wasn't, so it was kind of annoying, actually. So I made another introduction, because I don't think that one worked so well. So sorry, this is awkward. Okay, so this version of the introduction to the gallery talk just assumes that you already know what hidden architecture is, and so I'm not even going to talk about that. Instead, I'm going to talk about hidden architecture's rebirth, basically, or reemergence in 2010. So in 2010, there's a kind of gallery show at Columbia, which looks at Emilio Ambazza's show, Italy, the New Domestic Landscape, which was a show in which Superstudio was featured in. It was really the kind of introduction of the radical Italian architectural project to the US. And so here you see the reconstruction of Superstudio's model for that show. But in addition to this, they also published many of the works which these groups were working on prior to the Ambazza show. So here you see, as part of this, they published, in fact, the kind of total photographic archive of the original performance of hidden architecture. So originally there were 14 photographs published, and in the show at Columbia, they published over 200 photographs, right? And it's within these photographs that it offers a kind of alternative reading of this original project, and I would argue also an alternative reading of the end of modern architecture. So this is a scan of a really tiny thing, so I apologize for the quality. But in this photograph, you can see Adolfo Natolini and Cristiano Turaldo de Francia, who are in the act of sort of orchestrating the placement of the various objects within the photographs in relationship to the camera. So they're sort of designing the visibility of the performance. For a performance which otherwise reads as very ad hoc and casual, it's within this collection of 200 photographs that you see that it's actually highly designed, and that there is a kind of design agency working behind the scenes, right? It's also from this archive of photographs that Superstudio would proceed to sort of reinvent their own identity. They would sort of release these photographs, not photoshopped, I guess, but collaged or something, right? Recollaging their own identities. But this collection is interesting for that reason, but for me particularly it's interesting because of this set of 3 photographs. So the majority of the 200 photographs were taken on Kodak film, and this was a camera which was owned by Roberto Madriz, who is the he was this guy. So he was the industrial designer member of Superstudio. But this is a separate roll of film taken on Fujifilm. It's also at a separate location, so it's not in the workshop in which hidden architecture was actually performed, but it's in fact in the studio of Superstudio itself. And of course you'll notice there's a kind of peculiar double exposure taken in the center between a moment in which modern architecture is still alive and a moment in which modern architecture is no longer alive. There's something somehow in between the two, right? And so I was quite fascinated with this photo, particularly because of a few things. So the first is that it's not in Silvano Valeri's workshop where the performance took place, but it's actually in the Superstudio office, which is a few blocks away from Silvano Valeri's workshop. The second thing is that the box is in the same exact place. Right? So you notice that this is a photograph before the box is closed and then after the box is closed. But in both cases, the box is in the same place, and as well as the camera, suggesting that this was a kind of intentionally constructed double exposure, not, let's say, an accident, right? But because it's in the Superstudio offices a few blocks away, it also means that they carried the open box back to the studio. They took this photo, right? And then they took that open box back to Silveri's workshop. he soldered it shut, but he didn't polish it yet because the second version is also unpolished. They took it back to the studio again. They took the double exposure. Then they took it back to Silveri's workshop for a third time, in which he polished the box. They signed the letter. They labeled it. And then they brought it back to the studio again and took this sort of iconic photo of the group standing above the polished box. Right? So there's this sort of strange delay in between a sort of prolonged death of modern architecture, which has within it, let's say, a series of alternate possibilities or a kind of alternate ending for the original performance. And it suggests that this performance had, let's say, a kind of design, it was effectively designed, right? And so what I want to argue is that there's another way, basically, to read the performance of hidden architecture, not as a kind of didactic, frankly, a kind of critique of the exact position that Peter Eisenman was advocating for in his notes on conceptual architecture, but the idea that the performance itself is, in fact, the work of architecture. Okay? So within the performance, there's a plan, but not this plan. So this is the plan this is the kind of decoy plan. It may or may not be there, but there's also a plan here in the script. So this is the original 14-point script for the performance, which lays out the kind of procession much in the same way as a plan would do. At the same time, there's a tectonic in the form of the box, a tectonic which determines a kind of interiority and an exteriority, often as architecture does. There's a means of evaluation, not the conventional means of evaluation, but in this case, the sort of certification of Andrea Orsi Battolini, who testifies that architecture has in fact happened. And then at the same time, we get a series of credentials in the end. So the idea that the thing we've just witnessed has been done by architects and is then presumably sort of architecture, right? So then this, for me, is quite strange because on one hand, we're given the death of modern architecture, right? It's put into the box, it's burned and so forth, and it'll never come out. But at the same time, there's a kind of architecture hiding in plain sight, an architecture which is so radically expanded from what we would conventionally think of as architecture that we don't even actually recognize it, right? It's a kind of avatar which occupies this strange case of the box, the lawyer, the resume, and the script, right? Such that they're actually sort of killing architecture and then radically expanding architecture in precisely the same moment. So while I was working on this fellowship, I was thinking that this version of Super Studio is quite well known. The version that goes from 1966 until 1970. This version of Super Studio, the version where they sort of escape to the countryside, is sort of well known, but still well known, let's say. It's been researched and there's a kind of history of this work and so on. But I think there's been very little historical research on this version of Super Studio, the version which exists only within the double exposure of the 1970 photograph, a version which I was calling, just for means of differentiation to make it easier on myself, Super Impossible. So I decided that I wanted to do a kind of retrospective of the work of Super Impossible as part of basically the kind of Lefevre show. So this was sort of my second introduction to the gallery talk. But then I thought it's a little awkward, like why I wouldn't just have enough confidence, for instance, in my own design abilities to do a project, why I would need to invent a fake group of architects. So I'm actually gonna not give that gallery talk. Sorry. Apologies. Okay, so I'll just start over. So in this version of the introduction to the gallery talk, I was just going to assume that you guys knew already who Super Impossible was, and so I didn't need to explain them. And so instead, what I was going to try to do is to talk about why Super Impossible's work is distinctly different from the agendas of Super Studio's work. And I was going to do that through a kind of standard lecture format. I decided to rely on this. I don't know if you guys noticed, but oftentimes, like an architectural lecture will start with a film, they'll show some film, they'll show a clip or something, and then they'll try to shoehorn their own work together with some theme in that film. So that's what I'm going to do here. This is Charlie Chaplin's Gold Rush, 1925, of course. I'm not going to show the scene actually because frankly it's a little tedious, I find, but you know the scene, okay? So it's the famous scene from the film. Chaplin is, well, I guess there's a lot of young people, so I don't know. They're off in the Yukon, they're looking for gold, they're starving to death, they're gonna die. So that's the kind of setup, right? Chaplin goes out to look for food. Big Jim is too weak from hunger to go out to look for food, so Chaplin finds nothing, he comes back. Big Jim is freaking out, basically, at this point. Chaplin offers to cook him his last shoe. Big Jim can't handle this idea. And suddenly there's another kind of superimposition. In this case, Charlie Chaplin is superimposed with Big Jim's hallucination of a kind of giant chicken, right? So suddenly Chaplin becomes a chicken, and over the course of like 4 or 5 minutes, it's this constant state of sort of superimposition between Charlie Chaplin and this giant chicken walking around the room, right? Big Jim can't help himself, of course, and eventually takes to sort of chasing Chaplin as a giant chicken outside. Chaplin as a chicken waves his arms, Big Jim sort of snaps out of it, and that's the end of the scene, right? But the reason why I like this scene a lot, and why this superimposition allows us, I think, to think a little bit differently about the other superimposition, is basically the way this scene was constructed. So there's a guy named Peter Ackroyd who writes a book about Chaplin, and in it he performs a kind of analysis of how the scene was constructed on a kind of technical level. And they actually filmed the scene 3 separate times. And it's the 3rd version, so this version which I just sort of talked you through was the 3rd version. In the first version, there was no chicken suit, it was actually a real chicken. So it was Chaplin, and then they would cut, and then there was a real chicken on the table, and they would chase him around, right? This was not so funny, in a way, and I think in a way it makes sense, because if you were to describe this scene to someone, there's really nothing funny about it. It's like a guy is starving, he briefly considers cannibalism, and then he decides not to, and he's still gonna die. I mean, that's basically the kind of scene. So this first version was not funny at all. In the second version, they got the giant chicken suit, but it was technically inconvenient to have Chaplin continue to change back and forth between the chicken suit and his normal body. And so they had an extra inside the chicken suit. So they would constantly sort of switch back and forth between Chaplin and this extra. This was not so much funny, it was neither tragic like the first version, but it was just kind of silly, right? So here's that sort of superimposition again, right? In the 3rd version, as you can see here, it's Chaplin himself who plays the chicken. And so Chaplin would actually play the part of himself. He would then leave, put on the chicken suit, come back, so that they could perform this sort of superimposition. Right? Now there's quite an interesting book called The Odd One In, which is written by a theorist named Elena Zupetnik, and she tries to account for what it is we find funny about this scene here. And she argues that it's really a kind of beautiful argument, I think, that it's not so much the kind of insanity of Big Jim's hallucination, seeing Chaplin as a chicken, that we find funny, but actually in the end of the scene, when the chicken turns back into Charlie, suddenly we see, for instance, Charlie's small black eyes. We see the way he waddles when he walks. We see the way he holds his arms down to his side, and we realize that even though Big Jim was totally crazy, that actually he was completely right, that Charlie Chaplin is actually not a human being, he's a giant chicken. And for a split moment, this is what we find so funny about this scene. And so this, I think, is a kind of analog for how Super Impossible read the performance of hidden architecture. In other words, instead of, let's say, bemoaning the failure of the modern project, they instead invested in the failure of the modern project as precisely the source of its strength, right? So what you'll see in the exhibition are really 3 projects. Each project presents kind of alternative history of modernism in the vein of Super Studio, so an extremely condensed, sort of cartoonish version of the history of modernism. Each one looks not at the kind of transcendent ideals of modernism, but actually at the kind of failed finitudes of modernism, particularly in the form of the various protagonists and actors in the hidden architecture performance itself. So there's a project about the box, and particularly about a box which can be totally open and totally closed at the same time. There's a project about law and the history of the legal regulation of architectural aesthetics. And then there's a project about the relationship between graphics and the emergence of architectural professionalism in the 19th century. So, I don't know if maybe you guys guessed this, but at this point I was going to tell you about those projects. But somehow I felt like this Chaplin thing was a little too abstract, and I'm not sure it's quite clear enough. So I'm just gonna, was I on 3 or was I on 2? 3. I was on, okay, there we go. So I'm gonna give you a story from the archive, which sort of demonstrates this Chaplin effect in sort of precise architectural terms. So this is Taco Cabana. Is it Cabana or Cabana? Cabana maybe?
In Ohio, it's Cabana.
It's Cabana. This is Taco Cabana. It still is a Tex-Mex restaurant that was founded in San Antonio in 1972. They pioneered a rather unique style of a dining experience, which was called the Cabana style. And so you can see the Cabana style here in this image. The Cabana style is a kind of a patio and garage doors, basically. So that's the Cabana style. Now, interestingly enough, about 10 years later, there was another restaurant called 2 Pesos, which opened in Houston. And they also employed a style which is suspiciously similar to the Cabana style. So you can see here the kind of patio, the garage doors, and so forth. And you'll also notice that these images are sort of evidentiary images from a court case. So what emerged in the middle of the 1980s was that Taco Cabana sued 2 Pesos, basically for stealing their atmosphere. And this case was heard in a series of local courts in Texas for about 5 or 6 years, and eventually made its way all the way to the US Supreme Court, in which the court justices effectively had to determine what the relationship is between the objects which exist in architecture, walls, chairs, decor, and so forth, and an atmosphere, right? Because if you look at the 2 restaurants, there's actually nothing which is precisely the same. Like the organizations are all a little bit different, the colors are all a little bit different, so on and so forth. But at the same time, there's clearly a kind of atmosphere which is shared between the 2, right? So this is, in a way, a kind of impossible question. Like, how do you account for the existence of this similarity, despite the fact that everything is different, right? So you look at the plans also are extremely similar, but not entirely similar, right? The decor, they're both yellow. They both have the same kind of, I don't know what you call those, but things on the wall, right? But again, not entirely similar, right? So this presented a kind of immense problem because they couldn't effectively determine, basically they had to sort of theorize what the way in which an architectural atmosphere emerged. And so there is this really incredible series of court transcripts in which the various Supreme Court justices are trying to develop theories of architecture, particularly theories of architectural atmospheres. And you can, Super Impossible developed this as part of their first book in their book series. So you can read all this in the show there. But so I was sort of, I was going to keep going with that, but I think in a way, I'm not quite sure about this because in a way it's just another sort of instrumentality. So it's a kind of failed instrumentality, but still nonetheless an instrumentality. So I'm going to try a different route for this. Okay, so in this version of the introduction to the lecture, I'm just going to go basically straight into the like brutal specifics of the exhibition itself, and particularly the way in which the exhibition attempts to develop a kind of conflation, like hidden architecture, between work and work. In other words, between work as the kind of thing we present, versus work as the kind of labor which is necessary to produce a thing. Right? So the exhibition is not only a kind of retrospective of these three projects which Super Impossible did, but it also, like the kind of continual polemical redeployment of Super Studio's office, which is something they often did for their projects, it also is the kind of office space of Super Impossible itself. Right? So within the gallery, you'll find a kind of architectural office. Within this architectural office, you'll find the various archives which are necessary to produce the projects. So you'll find a series of hundreds of court cases, photographs, drawings, and so forth, which all animate these three architectural histories. You'll also find hundreds of inter-office emails between the various members of Super Impossible, in which they're rather self-deprecating, but they're sort of narrating their own design work. And so each of the projects has really multiple lives between the work, let's say the drawings, models, movies, animations, and so forth, which exist in the gallery, and then the work, or in this case the fictional work, the labor, which never really happened, but could have happened. Right? Then I was going to really talk about the kind of model stands. I got really obsessed with the model stands for this exhibition, basically because I think somehow it's one of the really interesting things to me about hidden architecture is the degree to which the performance is initially read as basically a kind of necessary construction in order to get the point across, and that it's through the analysis of the performance that you realize the performance itself is a kind of act of architecture, right? So there's always this play, I think, in hidden architecture in which the kind of medium and then the content are moving back and forth, right? So you'll notice in the gallery, in the exhibition, that the model stands, there's like 700 too many model stands, and some of them are like 12 feet tall, such that when you look at the show, you're looking at the show from inside a model stand. And sometimes the model stands appear in the drawings, and sometimes the model stands become buildings, and all of the model stands are a little bit too designed to really be read as model stands, such that it's not quite clear whether they're model stands or projects themselves. But that doesn't seem so interesting, so I'm just gonna go, this is my last lecture. So this is Bastian Adder. And he's one of my favorite people on earth, I think. He was a performance artist who worked in Los Angeles between 1968 and 1975. And he developed a series of pieces which were all based on the idea of false starts and failures as a way, basically, of sort of reevaluating the status of modern art in that moment. And so what he would do, typically, was to construct sort of impossible situations for himself, situations in which he would always fail, as a way of reenacting canonical pieces of modern art, or earlier modern art, right? So here he is reenacting Klein's Leap into the Void. He basically, this is part of a longer movie, the Adder piece on the right, in which he basically hangs from a tree until he loses all strength and then falls into the river, right? This is another piece in which he's standing in front of Mondrian's lighthouse, and he's trying to stand, in the video, he's trying to stand halfway in between a straight line and a diagonal line as a way of reenacting the argument between Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg, which resulted in their kind of falling out. And eventually, he can't hold this position anymore, and he falls down, right? So this is the kind of, the trope of, let's say, Bastian Adder, is to kind of continually reenact the history of modernism. But what's particularly interesting, I think, about Adder is that he does so not entirely ironically. Like, there's a kind of sincerity and a seriousness to his projects in the way that they actually always cause him physical damage, which suggests that there is something, that there is a kind of pursuit of the ideal, and at the same time, the belief in the impossibility of arriving at that ideal. And this is a kind of status which I think I'm quite interested in let's say, working with, which is basically to really believe hard in things that I know are impossible to do. And this is, I think, I hope, the kind of attitude which you'll get when you look at the projects, the three projects in the exhibition. So that's kind of it. I'll say, well, no, that's it. Thanks.